Welcome to the debate. Imagine you're sitting across from an interviewer, right? And they ask you about your proudest professional achievement. Now, if you stretch the truth, like if you claimed you led a project when you really just, attended the meetings and they catch you, your credibility just dies instantly.
Oh, completely. It's over.
Right. But on the flip side, if you downplay your role out of some sort of misplaced modesty, assuming, I don't know, anyone could have done what you did, well, you'll never even get the interview in the first place. So today we are looking at this razor-thin line of professional claim governance.
The gap between what you did and what you say you did.
Exactly. Specifically, we're examining how an advisor manages a client within the living professional record system, or the LPR. Because the LPR is designed to be this verified, evidence-backed history of a person's career. It's not just a self-reported resume.
Which is a huge distinction.
Huge. It's a ground truth mapping of what they can actually do.
And mapping that raw evidence to an actual public claim is incredibly complex. I mean, you have a mountain of raw data, emails sent, spreadsheets updated, meetings coordinated, and you have to somehow distill that into a coherent statement of capability.
Which brings us to the central question we were debating today. When mapping that evidence to claims, which represents the more critical, the more difficult challenge for an advisor? I'm taking the position that acting as a strict guardrail against overclaiming, like actively preventing a professional from inflating their evidence, is the primary, indispensable function of the advisor.
I figured you'd say that.
Well, it's true. The entire LPR system relies on absolute trust. If you compromise that trust, the whole system just collapses.
See, I will be arguing that correcting underclaiming is the far more vital and, frankly, difficult task. Policing inflation is relatively straightforward, but underclaiming is an error of erasure.
Erasure?
Yes. It requires an advisor to act as an investigator, to excavate hidden professional value that the client themselves has actively buried.
Okay, well, let's define exactly what we are dealing with first. Overclaiming is not always some malicious lie, right? It's an evidence gap. Overclaiming happens when the claim simply exceeds the evidence. Sure, we see this manifest as inflated ownership, invented metrics, exaggerated outcomes. And more, it takes the form of AI-inflated language or just using senior terminology when the underlying record completely does not support it.
The classic buzzword salad?
Exactly. And the reason overclaiming is an existential threat to the LPR is that it actively destroys the currency of trust. If an advisor allows an inflated claim onto a professional's record and an employer tests it, it's like walking out onto a bridge that looks magnificent from a distance.
Right.
Only to have the concrete just crumble under your boots. And that active collapse of trust doesn't just ruin that specific claim, it poisons the entire record.
Okay, I mean, you are focused on the structural collapse of the bridge, which, yes, is a real risk. But I think you are completely ignoring the psychology of erasure.
How so?
Because underclaiming happens when the client's real contribution is hidden, minimized, or just erased completely. A client will sit in an intake session and say, "Oh, I just helped out," or "I was just doing my job."
Which is very common, yeah.
It's extremely common. But when you actually look at the evidence, the Slack logs, the project timelines, the crisis interventions, the evidence shows highly complex coordination, tracking, decision support, or operational visibility.
But they just don't see it that way.
Right. And when someone overclaims, they're at least pointing at a real desire, you know? They are trying to participate in the market. When they underclaim, they erase their own operational footprint. The tragedy isn't a collapsing bridge, it's a ghost in the machine. They're doing critical, load-bearing work and receiving absolutely zero market credit for it.
Well, let's examine the mechanics of how this happens, what the material calls the evidence-to-claim gap, because this gap is incredibly dangerous, mainly because of how the market incentivizes what I call gap words.
Gap words.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at standard resumes today, they are littered with verbs like transformed, led, owned, expert, and enterprise-wide.
Oh, everyone is an expert nowadays.
Exactly. The market rewards these words, so professionals feel intense pressure to use them. So let's say a client comes to you with raw evidence that they drafted an onboarding checklist for a single 5-person team.
Okay.
A manager reviewed it, a few new hires used it. That is the verifiable reality. But the claim the client desperately wants to render on their LPR is transformed onboarding across the company.
Well, obviously the scope is entirely out of bounds there. I mean, the word transformed implies a structural change, and company-wide is completely fabricated based on that single team evidence.
Precisely. The outcome is wildly overstated. And this is where the advisor must act as a hard guardrail. It isn't just about deleting a word, it's about actively managing claim maturity.
Right.
The advisor has to look at the client and say, look, this claim isn't proven. It is at best emerging. It requires an immense amount of discipline to look a professional in the eye, someone who really wants to be seen as a leader, and tell them to power down their language.
That's fair.
Because if you don't fight that battle, the interviewer asks, tell me how you transformed company-wide onboarding, the checklist reality is exposed, and the interviewer immediately assumes the rest of the record is polished fiction.
See, you are framing the advisor's primary job as like a bouncer at the door of the LPR, right? Checking IDs and turning people away. I reject the idea that fixing overclaiming is the hardest part of the job.
You don't think it's hard to tell a client no?
I think fixing overclaiming is, frankly, a mechanical exercise. It's an arithmetic deduction. The client wants the verb owned. The advisor looks at the evidence and asks, did you have primary budget authority? No. Okay, the defensible verb is supported or coordinated. You downgrade the verb to match the reality. It's math.
Math? I think you are vastly underestimating the cultural tide driving overclaiming. It is absolutely not a simple mechanical swap because clients actively fight back.
Sure, they push back, but
They're armed with AI generators that just spit out paragraphs of hallucinated competence. They plug made a checklist into a language model, and it returns strategic operations leader driving enterprise enablement.
well, yeah, the AI inflation is definitely a headache.
It's more than a headache. On top of that, you have credential inflation. A client finishes a weekend introductory course on AI prompting. The supported claim is completed introductory AI training, but they want to claim they are an AI strategy leader.
Right.
To stop this, the advisor has to actively build a claims to avoid list. They have to formally designate certain claims as unsafe or unsupported to keep the client from constantly drifting back into inflation. It is a continuous active defense.
Okay, I understand the pressure. But think about it. If you downgrade a verb or set up a claims to avoid list, you are dealing with material that is already on the table. You are just shaping it.
Shaping it aggressively, yes.
But to fix underclaiming, the advisor has to pull evidence out of the shadows. The client didn't put it on the page. You can't just read the document and correct it. You have to act as a forensic investigator.
Okay, so what does that forensic investigation actually look like in practice if the evidence isn't even being presented by the client?
Well, it requires fundamentally changing the questions we ask professionals about their own work. If you ask an underclaimer, what did you do on this project? They will say, nothing special, I just updated the spreadsheets.
Because they assume everyone does that.
Exactly. That question fails because it triggers their modesty and their imposter syndrome. The psychological skeleton key here, and this is the aha moment for an advisor, is changing the question to, what did others rely on you for?
Oh.
That shifts the perspective from self-evaluation to external dependency.
Precisely. The moment you ask, what did others rely on you for? The underclaimer stops evaluating their own worth and starts stating facts about system mechanics. They say, well, the engineering team wouldn't release the weekly build until I check the compliance tracker. And the VP used my Friday summary to brief the board.
Wow.
Which completely changes the nature of the claim.
Entirely.
Suddenly, updating a spreadsheet isn't administrative overhead. It is informal leadership. It is cross-functional decision support. It is risk reduction.
Yeah, I see that.
Uncover the load-bearing value patterns that actually keep businesses running. Identifying those patterns and forcing the client to take ownership of them requires a level of diagnostic skill that goes far beyond just telling someone they aren't an expert yet.
Okay, I concede that uncovering hidden value requires deep diagnostic skill. That's a great point. But let's look at where the stakes are actually highest for the professional. It's when we reach the translation phase, taking those verified claims and figuring out what the outside market actually calls them. This is where the tension between overclaiming and underclaiming really peaks.
You're talking about mapping evidence to specific career lanes.
Yes, and we need to be clear about how these lanes work. There is a direct fit lane, which is simple. Your evidence shows you coordinated onboarding, so you apply for an onboarding coordinator role. The language matches seamlessly.
Easy enough.
But the risk skyrockets when a client wants to pivot into an adjacent fit lane, where the skills transfer, but the context is different, or a bridge-required lane, where they actually lack the necessary proof to make the jump.
And let me guess, you see the bridge required lane as the primary hazard here.
It is the ultimate hazard for overclaiming. A client wants to move into, say, AI workflow strategy. But their LPR only shows that weekend introductory AI exposure we talked about. That is a bridge-required lane. The client desperately wants to stretch their sparse evidence to fit this lucrative new role family.
And they try to write a positioning statement that reflects that.
Exactly. They draft a positioning statement that presents them as ready for leadership today. The advisor has to hold the line. They have to tell the client, look, you have a proof gap. You need an applied project, a tangible bridge, before we can render this as an established capability. If the advisor fails to hold that line, the client goes to market with a fundamental lie, and the entire system loses integrity.
See, I look at the exact same transition phase, and I see underclaimers failing catastrophically because they refuse to translate their own value. You are worried about the client who wants to jump a gap without proof. I am deeply concerned about the client who has overwhelming proof for an adjacent fit lane, but remains completely invisible to the market because they won't use the right words.
Because they feel disconnected from the new industry jargon?
It's worse than that. They feel like using market language is a form of lying. Let me give you a concrete example. Take a military logistics officer transitioning into civilian corporate operations.
Okay.
Their LPR is packed with incredible evidence. They have stabilized chaotic operations, managed intense logistical complexity, clarified cross-team handoffs under intense pressure. But when they look at their own record, they dismiss it. They say, oh, that was just internal military procedure. It's not useful here. Or someone who spent 5 years managing complex caregiving logistics will say, that was just family stuff. It's not professional.
So they have the raw value, but they don't know the exchange rate.
Exactly. It is exactly like a currency exchange. You can walk into a local store with $1 million in foreign currency. It represents massive real-world value, but you cannot buy a loaf of bread with it because it is not in the local denomination
That's a great analogy.
or nation. But the underclaiming client will never organically use those words. They feel like if they don't use their exact old military terminology, they are being dishonest. The advisor must step in and forcibly translate that hidden value into responsible market language. If they don't, the professional remains entirely invisible to the hiring manager, despite having a rich, deeply supported record of competence.
But notice what you just said. Responsible market language. Even in your scenario, the advisor is bound by the constraints of the evidence. They can translate the currency, but they cannot invent it.
Well, no, of course not. Which brings us back to the foundational premise of the LPR system. Claims need evidence. Skills are claims. A credential might prove a fact like that you attended a course, but it does not prove the full meaning of your capability. Every single assertion a professional makes must answer to the underlying record.
I don't disagree that evidence is the bedrock. My argument is about where the advisor's energy is most crucially spent.
And my position is that given the massive cultural pressure to inflate resumes, the ubiquity of AI-generated fiction, and the natural human desire to stretch credentials beyond their limits, the primary posture of the advisor must be protective. They are the guardian of the record's integrity.
But protection isn't just about limiting things.
But by identifying gap words, aggressively mapping claim maturity, and utilizing claims to avoid a strict boundaries, the advisor ensures clients do not outrun their proof. An honest, perhaps modest record is infinitely more valuable and safer than a spectacular one that shatters the moment an interviewer asks for a specific example.
A modest record might be safe, sure, but a severely minimized record does not serve the professional, and it does not serve the market that desperately needs their skills. It obscures talent. Guarding against falsehood is obviously a prerequisite, but the true art of the advisor is investigation and translation. The advisor must ensure that a client's humility or their imposter syndrome doesn't erase their actual operational footprint.
So it's about bringing it to the surface.
Yes. By identifying those hidden value patterns, risk reduction, continuity, decision support, and carefully exchanging them into the market's currency, the advisor excavates value that would otherwise be permanently lost.
You know, it seems like we are approaching the mechanism from opposite ends of human behavior. You are managing the professional's insecurity, and I am managing their hubris.
That's a fair way to put it, yeah.
But I think we absolutely converge on the ultimate doctrine of how a claim is governed. The gold standard for any advisor isn't about pushing the client down or pulling them up arbitrarily. The advisor's job is not to inflate. The advisor's job is not to minimize. The advisor's job is to find the accurate claim.
That is exactly it. The mandate is incredibly clear when you distill it down. Do not overclaim. Do not underclaim. Tell the truth at the right level of confidence.
Tell the truth at the right level of confidence. It sounds simple, but it is a remarkable tightrope to walk. It requires a sophisticated understanding of context, a deep empathy for the client's psychology, and an unwavering commitment to the evidence.
Absolutely.
And we really only scratched the surface of how these dynamics play out in the living professional record today. There is so much more to explore in how these mapped claims interact with privacy boundaries, like where a client might have perfectly proven, highly valuable claims that they are legally or ethically bound to keep hidden from the public market.
It leaves us with a lot to think about regarding our own self-perception too. I mean, when we sit down to write our own histories, are we more inclined to build facades that outrun our actual competence, or are we more inclined to hide our actual strength, assuming it isn't worth mentioning?
It depends entirely on the client, the day, and the desperation of the market, frankly. And that is why the objective, investigative judgment of the advisor is so critical. We will leave it to the listener to weigh which error requires more vigilance in their own professional lives. So, the next time you look at a professional profile or write your own, ask yourself, are you looking at a spectacular but structurally unsound illusion, or are you looking at a ghost, leaving immense value completely untranslated?
Tell the truth at the right level of confidence.
Exactly.
Until next time.